Hey everyone, welcome to the Mighty Books Podcast, where we sit down and chat with mighty authors about their books, message, writing successes, struggles, and other relevant authorship topics. I'm your host, Ryan M. Oliver, author of the Beasts of Men and Gods series. Now let's get started on today's chat. This episode's author on the Mighty Books Podcast is Denise Frisino. Denise Frisino is a local Pacific Northwest author. Her historical fiction novels dive into the eras of Prohibition and World War II, specifically the Pacific Theater. With vast experiences in teaching, acting, and writing, her stories have captivated readers, transporting them to dramatic eras, slipping further away into the ages. All right, welcome back to another episode of the Mighty Books Podcast. Today we have Denise Frisino. Denise, how are you doing today?
I am doing excellent. Thanks for asking.
You're welcome. So let's just jump into this thing. I'd love to hear about your book. What is the title of your book?
That is my second book, but it's the first in a series of the Orchids trilogy. And that particular book that you're referring to is Orchids of War.
So can you tell us a little bit about it without ruining all the fun little bits?
Well, sure. When I was doing research for my first book, which is Whiskey Cove, pertaining to Prohibition in the San Juan Islands, people don't understand that we had runners up here in our San Juans running from Canada to, down in through Seattle area, etc. So Whiskey Cove was my first book. But when I was up in the islands doing some research, somebody told me a story that there was a young woman at the University of Washington, and she was studying Japanese, and she was actually quite fluent in Japanese, but she was Caucasian. So this was right before the war broke out, World War II. What happened was, the FBI found out we have a Caucasian young woman who's fluent in Japanese. They tracked her down, they took her, coerced her into basically participating, is the way I presented in the book, and dressed her like a hooker and put her in the bars of San Francisco to listen to the conversations of the Japanese men in those particular bars that they chose, that they knew Japanese frequented. And in doing so, they were able to help discern and determine where the spy ring was, the Japanese spy ring, from Alaska to Mexico before the war broke out.
Wow.
So that's book one. Orchids of War. And then book two, Storms from a Clear Sky, stops on December 7th of 1941, Pearl Harbor Day. And it follows the same characters, but into both theaters, both the European and the Pacific theater. And then that one ends at 1943.
I'm assuming it's safe to say that the third book will end at the end of World War II?
Yes, the second book finishes at 1943, and then the third book, which is yet untitled, but I am working on it,
okay,
will go through the end of the war.
Very cool.
Follows these same characters.
Very cool. I love that kind of stuff. So what inspired you to get into writing about specifically World War II?
Well, when that storyline fell in my lap, more miracles just started happening. And over the last 9 years, I have been interviewing men and women from World War II to get the story straight. I've interviewed over 50 veterans from World War II to research for these books. So what I do is I take what they told me happened to them, and then I weave it in through my storyline to make it more powerful, more correct, more accurate, little details that people wouldn't possibly know about, except from the individuals who are telling them themselves.
Right. That's incredible. So 50 different veterans. How do you find these people?
When I would see a gentleman with a hat on that says World War II, I would chase him literally down the ferry line, through a Costco, through a grocery store, anywhere I could. I hung out at Post 227 in Seattle, North Seattle, and they helped me find living survivors of World War II, and I was able to interview several of them. And I put the word out, and you'd be surprised how many. Unfortunately, most of those that I have interviewed over the years have left us, and it's very sad and very hard to deal with. You fall in love with them instantly. I spent about 3 hours with each individual. I would make sure that there were no family members anywhere, because they will not talk. They don't want to talk about their first kill or how they suffered, or their bullet wounds, or this or that they had to endure and live through, the conditions in front of their family.
Mm-hmm.
They just didn't do it. So the best thing for me to do was make sure there was no one around, and then they would talk.
That makes a lot of sense. I've read a few books on World War II, specifically Flags of Our Fathers. That was a really powerful one. Iwo Jima and all that, the actual raising the flag and then the re-raising of the flag, which I thought was kind of humorous. But the father of the author, who was Jack Bradley, he was very similar. He would not describe what he went through, the horrors of war. And apparently his best friend died on Iwo Jima, or at least in the Pacific Theater. He would not describe what happened to him. It is revealed at the end of the book, but for good reason why it wasn't, because it was horrific. They don't want to bring that. They don't want to, as any parent would, you want to kind of protect your children or your loved ones from, the harsh realities of what other people can do to one another in certain situations like war.
And in addition to that, the wives would be really upset with me because they'd say, oh, now he's not going to sleep for weeks. The nightmares would come back. The memories. I had one interview when I got there. His daughter had written me and said, well, I don't know how today's going to go. And when I got there, he said, I don't think I can do this. I'm not going to be able to talk about this today. And I said, well, that's okay. Let's just sit down for a second. And I simply asked him where he was. And because of my years of research, I knew a situation that he had been in, which was the typhoon off of Japan, the horrific situation that our sailors got in and several lives were lost. And so I started talking about it, and I talked about this, another person who was in it and what happened to them. And all of a sudden he goes, really? And then luckily I turned on the camera, and 3 hours later, he was giving me books. He was showing me pictures, and I called him back and I said the next day, I said, did you sleep at all last night? Because it's, you carry all these stories in your heart. And he said, I actually did. I said, do you think it helped to talk? He said, I think it did.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a lot of give and take that goes on in these, if you're doing an interview properly and not stepping on their toes and, just sitting back and letting them tell the story the way they want to tell it, you're going to get a lot more.
Oh, 100%. You're not just going to get information. You're going to get feelings, emotions. And that's what I always loved about history is it's about, certain people, and you got names and facts and dates and places. Okay. Yeah, that's a part of it, but it's all a story. These people were real. They had real emotions. They were real people. They had families. They had losses. They had triumphs. That's what being human's about. And it just a different time period. So learning about those people, that time frame, that mindset, to me is those events is super important. And if you can connect it emotionally to those who are learning it, all the better. You've done your job, and you're better for it, because us, if you don't learn history, it's doomed to repeat.
I thoroughly agree on that point. And I think that was one of the draws. Once I started doing the research, and the story just started writing itself, seriously. I had so many miracles, coincidences, whatever you want to talk, whatever you want, title you want to give them, that they would fall under, happen as I was preparing these books, that it was absolutely phenomenal. I couldn't stop. I mean, I literally couldn't stop. Mm-hmm. So, it is pretty magical once that starts to happen.
Yeah. When the ball gets rolling and you got good energy and all you can do is sit down and just, put words to paper, and you just can't seem to stop doing it. It's like turning off on a faucet. It just doesn't stop until you turn it off. It's incredible. Sometimes you can't even turn it off.
There's techniques to writing that I've learned to employ. And that is, I only try to write for 4 hours every day. And I don't do it every day for, impossible.
Right.
Anyway, because life happens, and glitter exists, you want to go here, you want to go there. You've got to watch it in your research. But I like to leave at a point where I know the next step, so that I want to get there in the morning and start writing again.
Yeah.
So I will, on purpose, sometimes, if I have done my 3 to 4 hours or longer, I will stop, even though it's rattling around in my head. I'll, just know that I'm going to pick it up right there and fly with it in the morning when I'm fresh.
Yeah, that's really cool though. That's one way to do it. I want to say I do things similar. I usually try to tie it up in a bow where I've ended a chapter or something, but I do know the next step. I'm excited for the next event, the next conversation that I'm creating. So I go to bed kind of buzzed, if that makes sense. You're just kind of on this
Correct.
high of, wow, I just accomplished something. It feels good. But I'm ready to go tomorrow morning. And when I'm in the mood for that, I'll get up at 4 a.m. and start going.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I haven't had that buzz in a few months. I've been way too busy, but I'm hoping to get back into that. Just find some time to sit down and write some more. So a quick question about your series. So are all these books, do you need to read them in order, or so they can stand on their own?
Well, Storms from a Clear Sky, one of the reviewers who loved it, gave it a grand 5 stars and just raved about it, said, while this is a standalone book, why not start at the beginning?
Yeah.
Because it was so good. Why not start at the beginning and see how these characters met, began, developed, and go from there? So yes, you could do it, but you're going to miss out on a lot of history.
Yeah.
What I put in the first one, because I'm real old Seattle and my mother was born there, is I put in a lot of local history that a lot of people don't know.
Yeah.
So that's what makes it even more enticing, I think. The first one, Orchids of War, is set in Seattle, San Francisco, Hawaii, Bremerton, Dyes Inlet. There's some in there.
Yep.
So there's some scenes in there, but it's just those 3 basically for the first book. And then the other one expands across the United States and into Europe and into the Pacific.
Well, that's cool. Because I know sometimes people will pick a book up and go, hey, this looks really cool. They'll read it and realize, oh, there's more. And sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes it's a bad thing where like, oh, now I have to go back and read and follow up. But it's great when they can pick up and just have that spontaneous interest and start reading something that tickles their fancy. So that's good that it can be both. That's kind of hard to do. It's kind of hard to do.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. I'm excited to finish your book. I started about a month ago. I've only gotten about 4 or 5 chapters in, and I want to keep reading it. It just life happens.
That's right. Life happens.
Life happens.
Especially in the summer.
Oh man. Well, we're happy that we're doing that. We're doing more stuff this summer. Last couple summers we've done not nearly as much. So I'm really glad we're doing that now. So let's see. So you said you've interviewed 50 folks? 50
Correct.
plus?
Over 50. Over 50 in the last 9 years.
Oh my God.
And numerous books and museums. And another thing that I like to do is I like to stand where I'm writing about, if at all feasible. So for example, in 2014, December 7th happened on a Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to be there on a Sunday. I wanted to see the moon over the Paoli that the Japanese planes came in on. I wanted to see what it was like standing above Kaneohe when the wind, the surf, the smell of the ocean. So I was there at 7:45 that Sunday morning, and sure enough, the full moon was behind me, and I could just envision it. So I really like to try and feel the places I'm writing about.
Mm-hmm. That's a huge impact because it's hard to imagine. It's so much easier to almost just kind of be a recording, you know what I mean? Where you're just recording down what you're feeling, what you're seeing, what you're smelling, getting all the senses in there. It brings it home to the people who are reading it, brings it home for you, gives you a good connection with the story. I love that idea. So those interviews you recorded, because I know you said you did record them, where are they on somewhere we could actually go see, or are the people you interviewed wanted them to be private?
No, some of them, snippets of some of them are up on my blog. I have some blogs started, but like life gets in the way and I don't have them all done. And then I am going to be editing them together and getting them up. And I have another World War II interviews is a blog that I'm going to be creating. I own that one. So I'm going to be creating that one.
Okay.
But right now it's just under Denise Frisino, www.denisefrisino.com.
Okay.
I have a web page that has a lot of history on it and some of the some of the interviews, and it coincides with my YouTube channel as well.
Okay.
So
Yeah, that's something
yeah.
to check out too. I would love to dive in on that and read a little bit or read into it and listen to it. Just because getting it from a first person first person source, that's hard to do, especially nowadays. Unfortunately, a lot of our World War II veterans, they're no longer with us. That's how many years ago that when it started. I mean, what
1941.
1941 for us, but on the
The
the Atlantic
37s and
theater.
the 39s
Yeah.
in Asia. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
And Europe.
39 technically 39 with the
Europe.
invasion of Poland. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And 37 about in China and Asia.
Oh,
so
okay.
it was a longer war than we knew about, really,
Mhm.
even though, what's interesting is my father had graduated from high school, and he was working at a newspaper back east. He was a reporter, but he was, as a young student, he was working for the Baltimore Sun in their library. And he was helping with the photographs that were coming in from all over the world of the battles. And so my father said, "Oh no, I'm joining." So he joined, and he was just about to get out. He'd already served his year's time, and he was just about to get out when he walked in one day, and all the men were around the radio, their heads down, and they're all listening intently, and Dad like, "Oh boy, this does not look like it's good news at all." And so, one of them shouts, "Hey, Joe, they attacked Pearl Harbor." Well, they had to go get an encyclopedia to find the map of Pearl Harbor. Most of the people I interviewed didn't even know where Pearl Harbor was at that point in time in history. So it just goes to show you that the world really opened up to everyone, and knowledge of what was going on. Of course, not the media we have today, which is TikTok or slip of this or that or the other, and you know it instantly. But back then it did. And they did a lot of tricks with the news, of course, back then, much more so than they can do now. But anyway, so my father was in. He said he did 4 years of overtime.
4 years of overtime. I like that. Yeah, the media, there was a little bit of a delay between what the event that took place and people actually learning about it. So, but I feel like it was a lot more impactful. Nowadays, I feel like attention span is a lot less. There's a lot more stuff around, and people are kind of putting blinders on to ignore it. Back then, you only had one media outlet, maybe two: radio, newspaper. Yeah, it was about it. Not really, TV necessarily wasn't a huge thing.
The movie reels.
Yep, you had. Because I know
you'd go to the movies to watch the reels.
Yep, yep. You can learn a little bit what's going on.
But those were Hollywoodized, and they were, definitely strategically set to either build up the Army, the Navy, all of the forces, or and to show the others as this, that, and the other.
Yeah, well,
our opposition.
The propaganda in not just America, but I mean Japan, Germany. Germany was insane. The Nazis really loved, or at least Adolf Hitler really loved his films. Loved film, loved recording everything, and of course, pamphlets, flyers. I mean, that's just not just with Germany. That was every country was going to war. We're doing it for this particular reason. And they got everyone underneath that mantra or idea, and they went off and they're fighting for something. So, and that was ingrained in them from birth all the way till adulthood, when they could fight or support in some way.
And another interesting thing about that time period was the perception of Americans in the different cultures. For example, the Germans, they didn't see us as lowly as the Japanese did. To the Japanese, the word dog was used several times to define the American. And the Germans, maybe it was our facial recognition or what have you, or, I have some German in me, maybe that's part of it, but we were not beset upon as being really low lives as compared to, well, Japan had been so isolated for so many years, and then they opened up their gates again. Yep. But it was a whole different perception, and that's why the difference between prisoners was so different. The way the Japanese treated prisoners compared to, I mean, Germany was absolutely positively no saint, but
No.
the Japanese,
Yeah, it was pretty brutal.
pretty brutal.
Pretty brutal.
Some of my interviews were just, most of them, if they were in the Pacific, they said they never wanted to be captured because so many of their friends who had been captured were simply, beheaded or,
or worse, or a lot of terrible stuff happened. I know, but a story that rang true is pretty terrible. What the Japanese government was telling their people, what Americans were like. There was a story of, I can't remember what island it was on, but there were some GIs, some Marines were, they were leaving a battlefield. They're doing a scout. They're on patrol, something where they found a small village, and there was a woman holding her child, and he's like, hey, he's trying to communicate, hey, we'll feed you, give you some shelter, because they had been out in the woods for a while, and she's petrified. She's holding her child, and instead of coming with them, she jumps off the cliff with her kid.
That was Okinawa.
Was it Okinawa?
That was okay. Okinawa, and hundreds jumped. It wasn't just her. It was really sad, and the men who had to watch this were mystified. But it was indeed what they had been told.
Yeah.
Rape, murder, torture. Yeah. All of these things were going to happen to them, instead of, here's food, here's water, here's stability. But that was a tragic scene on the cliffs at Okinawa when that happened.
The fact that the propaganda was so strong that to make people think that others in the world were so devoid of compassion that they would be willing to jump off a cliff, not just by themselves, but take their child with them. That's a thought I can't even really fathom. I can say the words, but the emotion behind that, the impact on a person's psyche or even a culture's psyche, that's incredible.
Absolute, rooted in fear.
Yeah.
And what's interesting too is that we had in America, we had what was called kibis. It was a Japanese term, which meant that they were born in America. So they were American citizens, Japanese, but they would go and study in Japan and then return. Well, think of it. Think of the training that they're getting in Japan of what they think about the Americans and who we are, even though they're an American citizen. So when the FBI was trying to find the spies and things, it was the kibis that they were really worried about the most, because they were a lot were sent back to the United States right before the war broke out. But they were still in the Navy, still in the Army. They were still in the under Japanese control.
Right.
So to finish up that thought, to go back to the kibis. So literally right before the war broke out, thousands of Japanese were sent back to America or came to America. One of the ways of access and means of access was through the fishing industry up in Alaska. And then they were working their way down, or through Mexico. There were several. They say that there was, ships in Mexico of Japanese, and one crew would go out and a different crew would come in. So they were meeting submarines off the coast. We had submarines going up and down our coast.
Yes.
Especially right after the bombing at Pearl, they came over. But I don't want to make it sound like I'm against the Japanese or anything, because remember, this was a totally different time.
Yes,
this was war.
Mm-hmm.
This was different. And so what I did in my book was I made my lead, Billy, I gave her the name Billy. I made her best friend be Japanese. So she does not want to participate in this in any way, shape, or form.
Yes.
And she's just torn because she loves the Japanese culture and the Japanese people, and yet she is compelled and tricked into helping the FBI locate one specific spy who was one of the leaders here on the West Coast, down in San Francisco.
Right.
So
yeah. No, it's just all we're doing is reciting facts and research. I
Right.
mean, there, yeah, the culture back then was just different. I mean, it was just different. There was a lot more harsh judgment, and also again, we kind of go back to the media. There's a disconnect back then, that time delay. People can nowadays, you can literally call somebody up on your own personal phone and talk to somebody from a different country and get to know them personally. You can fly over there with really no issue other than, the potential health restrictions or whatever, and get to know the culture. I work around Navy bases that send people to Japan to work at other naval bases, and they get to know the culture there. And so that intermingling is a lot more pertinent nowadays than it was back then, until World War II. Because a lot of people actually, I know a lot of men and women met up because of the war.
After the war, when we went in to help rebuild Japan, and it was a necessity at the time because Russia was moving down through the Japanese islands and trying to take over Japan. So we went in and started reconstruction immediately. And a lot of some of the men that I interviewed married Japanese women.
Mhm.
And they said that because so many of their men had passed away, there was a lot of young women, that the Japanese fathers were encouraging the marriage of their daughters
Mhm.
to the Americans. So that was a really interesting part of history for me to learn about what it was like living in Japan right after to rebuild it. And because we hear about Europe an awful lot more than we do about the reconstruction of Japan and what America did for the Japanese
Mhm.
right after the war.
Yeah. And that's good when in times of, grief and everything, you're going to come together. And this is a shared experience where we're dealing with war, we're dealing with loss. And if people can find a way to come together and heal and be not just allies, but friends or even loved ones, that's excellent. And again, hopefully that kind of conflict will not happen again, because we've known, I know, hopefully, look, given current current strife and events that are taking place, I really hope it's not going down that way, but hopefully we can and have learned. But unfortunately, I've learned, I have met many people my age, I'm in my early 30s, who don't know a lick about World War II, World War One, even some of the more recent military conflicts or conflicts or wars. It's kind of sad.
Well, the way I approach my stories is because I did theater all of my life. And so my characters are extremely strong and very lively. And so the way I approach this huge chunk of our very important history is to, of course, have the conflict, but have the characters that people want to follow and know about and care about, of course, which is primary to a good book. But they, I have them doing things that people don't know about. Even those who are familiar with World War II and have been in the service, I've asked them things like, well, do you know about the black cats
Mhm.
in World War II? And Navy, just recently, last weekend, Navy, he shook his head no. And I said, well, you better buy this book then. So because the black pack cats were the name given to the PBYs in the Pacific. And somebody had the brilliant idea to paint them black, the patrol boats, the big ones, the huge Catalina PBYs, and paint them black and take them out on night raids with actual bombs on them.
Oh my gosh.
And the Japanese called them Whispering Death, or with the ghosts of death. They were terrified because they would just come out of nowhere.
Sure.
And
What does PBY stand for?
patrol boat Catalina.
Oh, okay.
It's the one of the it can be it's amphibious. It lands on water. It
Okay.
is what was at the Kaneohe base,
Mm-hmm.
basically, is where the patrol boats were, the PBYs were going out of.
Okay.
And they are very slow, very
They're probably quiet too.
quite quiet. Well, you can trim them back so that they're extremely quiet because their wingspan is huge. But they were used to land on the water and save people whose boats had sunk or things of that sort for rescue. But in the South Pacific, they were able to, because of the pontoons, they were able to get into little nooks and crannies, and being painted black and coming out at night, it gave them a real advantage. So I had that. And then another aspect of the service that a lot of people don't know about are spars. You have the whacks, you have the waves, but during and only during World War II, the Coast Guard had women called spars. The Simpropritas always ready. So the spars were the women who took over for the men along our coast. And they were in the radio shacks. They were, running whatever it would take to free the men. Because during World War II, a little known fact is the Coast Guard men were the ones who were really skippering, piloting the boats, because the Navy, their men were busy. We had more boats than, so the Coast Guard was heavily called upon to do that. So I have like little things about that in there. I was lucky enough to interview 3 spars. They were fascinating. Yeah. Fascinating women.
Oh,
yeah.
So interesting.
Yeah.
That's super. I didn't even know about that. I didn't know about
Yeah.
that.
Mm-hmm.
And World War II is such a huge topic. I mean, you can study all your life and still find things you didn't know about.
I don't pretend that I know very much about this war, and I've been at it for almost, going on not 10 years.
Right. I started studying it when I was in middle school, and on and off for 15 years or so, and not heavily, but I mean, if I find a good story, you read it, learn about it, dive into it. But there's always something more to learn. It's incredible. Absolutely incredible. A good book it's on D-Day, The Longest Day, by Cornelius Ryan. That one is very well done. It's not just here's a date and a time, but it actually goes into the actual events, the micro events that taken place within hours before D-Day's launch.
Well, one of the snippet interviews I have on there is Joe, and he was at D-Day, first wave. Yeah,
on Omaha.
Oh
my
yeah,
God.
it's heart rendering. His story.
I bet
he had served in Africa, so he was considered an old man at the age of, maybe he was 20 by then, or what have you, or this is the other thing, is they were all, so many at 15 went in, 16 and 17 lied, they did everything else to get in to serve. And so he was considered an old man. So what they did in the landing crafts was they put 2 old men, 2 of the seasoned fighters, in with all of the new young men. And out of, I think he said it was 42 in that landing craft, 3 survived just the landing. They jumped too soon. They didn't listen to him. He said, no, put everything down. Don't do it. Don't go yet. Don't go yet. He said they made a lot of mistakes that day, but that was really one of them, was having so many young men perish prior to even, shooting their guns.
Yeah, it's a different time, different world. I mean, a little off topic, but same venue. If you've read All's Quiet on the Western Front, different story, different war, World War I, trench warfare. It's on the German perspective.
Correct.
It was interesting when I was reading that, the excitement, the electricity of, boys going to fight. I mean, they were real young. We're going to go fight for our country. We're going to go make, people, mom and pop proud. But they didn't realize the actual reality, what you will lose during war. I'm not a military service veteran by any means. Several friends and family have gone through and seen combat and conflict, and I can only speak from what they've told me, but it changes you.
It absolutely does. Yeah. I mean, it sounds glorious or what have you, but the reality is it's just exhausting and stays with you forever. And it's not as easy to kill somebody in defense. Yeah. And out of necessity, as people make it look like on these games. These games are nuts these days. But it's interesting that, back to what you were saying about wanting to be in the war.
Mhm.
One man told me that after Pearl, he got up and he ran down to the long lines. There were long lines to get into every service the next day. The Army, the Navy, the lines were so long that he got frustrated and he was walking back by and he kicked a sign over it and it fell and he picked it up and it said, Coast Guard, enter here. So he went in and joined the Coast Guard. You know, he didn't have an affinity for any service. He just wanted to fight and defend America and his family.
Yeah.
And he was a coastie then. He was out there in the Coast Guard for
Wow.
us. So,
Did we have any casualties in the Coast Guard?
yes, of course.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay.
Monroe, actually from Washington State, was the first casualty of the Coast Guard, and that was in the Pacific Theater. He landed some of the Marines. Was it Marine? Yeah, Marines. He landed some Marines and they'd gotten the wrong information, and they got the call back, go get them quick because they're surrounded.
Yeah.
So he went back in to get them, and he got them out. Some of them were injured, but he got them out, but he took a bullet.
Oh man.
The FBI their hands were tied. Of course, one of the things that was going on was we didn't want to fire the first shot. A really good, one of my favorite books in all my research was is a story about the ship, a sailboat. It was actually in the movie The Buccaneer. It was commissioned because, you know, they took everything. They took your yachts. They took everything and that floated. And in particular, this one only had a cannon on it from World War I, and they called it a Navy. Woo, almost in trouble there. Called it a Navy ship and sent it out. Roosevelt said, send 3. They sent 3 little ships straight at Japan from the Philippines in the hopes that Japan would fire the first shot. Cruise of the Lana Kai is the name of the book.
Mhm.
Incredible story. They were spotted by a Japanese, basically, patrol plane, but they never shot at them, which was what they were trying to do, was draw the first bullet. And then they were called back. Well, they were called back, and then they were going to be sent out again to try it again. And they attacked Japan and the Philippines. The Japanese attacked Hawaii, and the Philippines on the same day. So remember that, the timeline, it was actually the same day. It was just because of the timeline, it appeared to be a day later.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but The Cruise of the Lana Kai is a brilliant book about how we were trying to have the Japanese fire the first shot to draw us into the war. Can you imagine being on one of these little schooners and going out and, putting right at Japan in the hopes that they're going to fire at you?
Yeah, no, that sounds terrible. That sounds absolutely ridiculous.
Camp Tolley is the author. Cruise of the Lana Kai, truly one of my favorite books.
So during all of your research, was there one or maybe two pieces of information that you learned that was just either mind-blowing or really surprising?
Countless numbers of those,
I'm sure.
But let me try and make it local and to the point of the Japanese spies here. Learning how, you have to think of the Japanese culture and how thorough they are, or and specifically at that time. So it was well thought out and very well organized, and it was very subtle. There were books going back to Japan that were supposed to be English reading books. They were pictures of bridges, dams, and things of that sort. They had groups set up, and every time the FBI would find out about the group, and what the group was doing was a Japanese men, and they had to be members. And remember that as a Japanese, no matter where you're living, when you turned 18, you were to be part of their service, Navy or Armies. I mean, it was mandatory, but no matter where you were living. So these groups were collecting money and sending it back to Japan so that they could attack America. And these are groups living in America. Mm-hmm. And they were every month you had to give money, etc. So it was interesting finding out about those. So every time the FBI found out, they just changed their names. they would change their names. I've got a lot of that in my second book in particular, because the FBI, like I was saying, their hands were kind of tied because nobody had fired the first shot. So they couldn't go in and into the homes like they wanted to until that had happened. And they could only go in homes that were not bought in the child's name. If it was owned by an American, and a lot of times what they were doing was they were buying the homes in the child's name. But but they were finding radios and arms and things of that sort when they did go into some of these suspected places.
Right.
Now, and here's the other thing. We had just cracked Code Purple. We being the OSI and the intelligence. Magic, they called it magic. So we had just been able to read Japanese mail, so to speak, correct?
Right.
And so we had just cracked that. Now, had we, let's say I knew Ryan was suspected, and I went and I arrested just Ryan, what would they know? They're reading my mail. So they had to be extremely careful, and they had to cover a lot of bases and keep it. Had the Japanese figured out that we were reading their mail, we would have lost it. Midway, we would have possibly lost the war.
Wow.
Because we had so much going on and dependent on that. And that was, a lot of that was out of Oahu, and I have it in my book where that was set up. You never would have known where it was.
There is a pretty impressive, so in Oahu, this is years ago. This is maybe 9 years ago. 8 years ago, we did a family vacation down to Oahu. And there's I don't know if it's there anymore. There's a brewery down there called Home of the Brave Brewery, but they do a tour, an entire island military tour, where they go to the air bases, they go to Pearl Harbor, they see the Arizona, everything. And along the way, they actually have Japanese espionage information down there too. I was very surprised to hear that there were Japanese espionage spy rings and all sorts of different things like that. So that was a very surprising. So when I heard about your books, I got really excited because I didn't dive deep into that at the moment. So it'll be really cool to learn more and more about the intricacies of this on the West Coast.
Gordon Prang, who wrote At Dawn We Slept, which is, a magnificent book. He spent 35 years researching it. Now, the thing about his book was it was published before the Freedom of Information Act. So he wasn't privy to a lot of the information that is out now about the spies and the Japanese spies and their communications, and their comments about Boeing and about Bremerton, what's at Bremerton, and what's where over at Elahi, which is in the Bremerton naval areas. So I mean, he did not have that information. But the point being, I think it's chapter 7. He says that there's only 2 original occupations on the face of the earth. One of them is hooking and one of them is spying. He says it goes back to biblical times. So to say that there were no spies of a certain culture is borderline incredulous, because everybody had spies. And you can't take a culture as large and as well organized as the Japanese and say that they didn't have spies on American soil.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Any country worth their salt, they had to figure out what everybody else is doing, because are they planning on attacking us? What are their capabilities? Because what's the old saying? In times of peace, prepare for war. How else are you going to do that unless we got a pretty big stick, but how big is the stick the other guy holding too?
Exactly.
That's unfortunate. That's reality. We gotta know this to defend ourselves. Well, if he's holding the stick, maybe we get a log, we get a rock. You know what I'm saying? How do we have to have a wall? They have got a wall. Let's maybe start building walls. Yeah.
And we had the Japanese on our coast, and on the East Coast, it was the Germans, but they did used to meet off of Mexico and exchange information and oil and maps and things of that sort. So they were working together on our coast, so it's not like we were the only ones who had them here, but they were concentrated Japanese were concentrated along our coast.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that you used to be in, art and theater, and I read that you were were you in films too?
Correct.
Can you talk,
Yes.
can you talk a little bit just about your experience with that?
Sure. Yeah, I worked in the film industry for years. I was a member of, or Seattle's, what is called Women in Film. I worked in LA in the film theater. I did on-camera work. I used to write, direct, and produce shorts and things of that sort, commercials. I've written a little bit for theater. So that's why I was saying that, having acted, and I always, when I'm teaching and writing class, I always highly recommend, if you want to be a really good writer, take an acting class. Think about it. When you are in a class for acting, you learn dialogue, pacing, sets, costumes. You learn it all. And or at least you're exposed to it and what it should be, and what a good play would look like, and the importance of the good strong dialogue that sounds different with each character and is
Sure.
unique. And so I always encourage that, because I think it also draws a lot out of you as a writer and helps.
Hmm.
So yeah. Oh, you can you can look me up on, I used to do a lot around here in Seattle, but I haven't done much in years.
Yeah. Well,
But
that's
who
really
knows?
exciting.
I might jump right back in. Who knows?
Why not? Just like riding a
That door's
bicycle.
always open, honey.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. You haven't shut the door forever.
Yeah,
Oh, that's
no.
cool. And so you also used to teach too?
I taught. I taught in
Nice.
Seattle Public Schools for over 10 years. I
Fabulous.
taught media and drama, which were my favorite subjects. I taught a little English as well, but I really preferred to be in the drama, and teaching young students the beauty of stage
Yeah. Yeah.
and things of that sort. I mean, it's such a powerful tool to have in your toolbox. You never know when you're going to be asked to speak publicly, or write something, or interpret something. And I think that you learn all of that when you do theater.
Yeah, I never did any theater, but the public speaking aspect of it is really important. When I was a young kid, it was absolutely traumatizing to do anything public speaking. I mean, we're talking elementary, middle school, whatnot. But over time, I learned that I really do enjoy the teaching aspect, teaching others. And I went into college to be a teacher, became a teacher, and then didn't like the public school as much. So, but now I'm back into educating, but I'm teaching adults. I'm instructing with the Department of the Navy. A lot more my speed, a lot more. You get topics that are a little more interesting. You don't have to worry about behavior as much. But when it comes to that, getting comfortable to talk in front of a crowd, that is a really powerful thing.
And it never hurts to learn it at an early age, because it helps you to overcome it, hopefully.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah. There's still a little bit of
it
anxiety, but
does.
it's light. You know what I mean?
Well, any actress will tell you, if you're not nervous before you go on, there's something the matter.
Yeah, you're obviously not
Butterflies,
caring.
butterflies, you're supposed to have blood butterflies. It's okay.
Yep, and that's still got those, but I mean, it's nothing. It's not nearly like what it used to be, so it's a good thing. Always want to get out of your comfort zone a little bit. I think that will help you in the long run. Help you in the long run. So you always want to reach.
You know what? One of the things we haven't discussed is my Jack, the FBI agent.
Okay.
Oh, everybody always says, "Oh, he's a piece of work," And it's interesting as a writer. You're the crazy thing about the difference between theater and writing. Theater, you hear the applaud, you feel your audience, you know when they're liking something, and you can play it up more. As a writer, you're stuck in your basement, you're alone, there's nobody around, maybe a cat will visit you if you're lucky, your tea goes cold. I mean, it's just such a whole different thing. So when people respond, when you hear back from your audience as a writer, it's always, I think I listen 3 times more, I'm more intense with my listening. And so when I get the kind of response that I wanted to elicit of one of my characters, it's thrilling.
Yeah,
It's thrilling.
it is. It is really thrilling. I would agree with that. I would agree with that. I'm Still hoping to get a little more myself, but I know just from the little I've read from yours, you can definitely tell that you've got some spunky people in there, very spry, very strong folks in your stories. So I know that came from research and from your background. So.
Well, and I don't try to I try to write
realistically.
Well, and at I don't want to use the word level, but I guess so, at a level that is enjoyable for all, so that I had one person tell me he was not a reader, and then he read my book and he loved it. Yeah. So you see, I think one of the duties of a writer is to entice people to read. Mm-hmm. You know, it's not just your story and about you. It's also how is the reader handling the information you're giving them, and are they enjoying it, and are they excited about, the craft and reading, because reading is essential. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's essential to being a good, a well knowledge educated person, and it's very pleasurable. If you enjoy reading, I say highly do it as much as you can, within reason, obviously. But being a writer, heck, maybe you can speak from experience here as someone who did theater. I'm sure reading was a big help for you too. I know writing for me, just on the basis of vocabulary, how setting scenes work, good dialogue, all that you learn from others. We learn from our parents. Authors learn from other authors, actors learn from other actors, so on and so forth. If you're not reading while you're working on your craft, you're really not growing as a writer, at least in my opinion.
Well, now I'm going to play the devil's advocate on that. I'm dyslexic.
Yeah.
So I was in theater to protect myself, basically, because I could memorize in 2 seconds, but I was not a fast or a strong reader at all.
Sure.
And one of the tricks I did was I would read the newspaper. Remember those old things, the newspapers?
I do. I used to read the newspaper.
I would read the newspaper out loud. Somebody, when I was in college, had to teach me that.
Really?
Yes, to help my reading was to read it out loud. I mean, literally, I could memorize in 2 seconds, and that's why as a writer, I can't read anybody else's work about World War II that is nonfiction. Because who knows, I might steal something right out and don't even know it, but my memory is that way. So I only read factual things that I can find. And that's why I've leaned so heavy on my interviews as well, is because I want it to be fresh. I want it to be mine. If I've taken anything from anyone, I'm sorry, didn't mean to, outside of the history of the situation. But
that makes total sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
You got to figure out what works for you, and then you got to go with it.
Exactly. And same with your writing time, when you write, your writing style, all of that. It's a process of elimination, and it's a lifelong journey if you decide to go that way.
Yes, it is.
I did not publish my first book until I was 60, twice your age.
60? Yeah. I got my first one published when I was 31. So
yeah. Well, I mean, I had written articles and I'd written all kinds of other things, sure. But I had never written a full-length book.
Well, I mean, it takes it's a process. Learning how to write a book is a monolithic process, monstrous process. The only reason I was able to do it was because I had a schedule change. I mean, that's all it was a schedule change where I was given like 5 hours during the day where I had nothing going on. And I was like, well, I guess I can dust this old story off and give it a shot. And that's what I did, started getting on with it. And then all of a sudden I had a manuscript done. But if they had kept me on the same schedule, I probably would still be collecting dust right now. So, I mean, I probably would not have had time to do any writing until I retired, in 25 years. It just, life is busy.
Well, and it's amazing what prompts you to do something. For me, I was getting the book out, published. I'd had it done for years. And I had been talking to Paul Dorpat, the historian, dear old friend Paul Dorpat, about it. And he called me one day and he goes, "Hey, Denise, where's that book you wrote on prohibition?" I said, "I don't know. It's around here collecting dust on one of my shelves somewhere." And he goes, "Well, get it out. Ken Burns is doing this thing on prohibition. And I told Channel 9 that you were the expert on prohibition in the Northwest. So hurry up and get that thing published." And I hung up the phone with Paula and I, "What have you gotten me into?" Well, I did get it out and published. And that I self-published, and it's doing quite well, by the way. But I got that one out and published 3 days before Ken Burn went up, because I didn't want anybody saying, "Oh, you took that story from Ken Burns." No, I had researched that one and written it, a decade before. And now I have it in script form. So I'm working on that edge with it as well.
Heck yeah.
And that's something to think about when you're looking at your book. Now, Whiskey Cove, I knew would always be a movie. Hopefully a movie. But the other books, Orchids of War and Storms from a Clear Sky, they are written to be a series. If you look through the way I've written it, the back and forth of the chapters, you could easily cut that. Now, that's my thought process of thinking, because I've been in that industry for so long. So, that just kind of came to me, and it's the way it's structured so that it would be easily translatable.
So I'm saying it would be a good play?
No, a good mini series.
Oh, a mini series.
Storms.
Okay.
Orchids of War and Storms would really translate well. A friend of mine who's a director did say, "Denise, this reads like a movie." And I said, "Well, good, thanks, because that's exactly the way I wanted it to read." You have the different things going on at the same time, and and the flow is straightforward in this one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I get that a lot as well. And I what's funny is I hear that more often, not just from me, but I hear that from other authors' books too. And I really think it's just kind of how we interpret the world. How else do you interpret the world other than what you see, hear, feel, touch, and see? I mean, it makes sense to me. It acts like a movie. There's a reason why people go to the movies sometimes more than they will read a book.
Well, I know, and it's a glorious dream to have now, isn't it? I
100%.
mean, whether or not it ever makes it, past the page onto the screen will remain to be seen. And but you have to, that's the other thing, is you've got to have a vision and you've got to stay with it. You just can't give up on writing because somebody says, "Oh, that's terrible," or "I didn't like it that her eyes were brown. Why are her eyes brown?"
Right.
Why is he tall and skinny? I mean, there are people who, well, jealousy is always reigns. There's people who are jealous of you because maybe they liked it more than they're willing to share, or something, or for some other reason.
Right.
So you've got to put aside all of these roadblocks and just look at me. I'm dyslexic, could never spell. Didn't stop me. I've got books out, got all kinds of things out. But you just got to be willing to be dedicated enough to stay with it and not give up on your dream.
Yep, exactly. That's exactly what you have to do. There's gonna be a lot of naysayers. There's gonna be a lot of negative Nellies out there. If you enjoy, my thing is, if you enjoy what you're doing, if you think you got a good story, then keep doing it. I mean, who's it going to hurt? It's going to hurt you if you don't do it. So stick it out, enjoy it, play with it. You're bound to find someone who's going to love it enough to sit down, read it, watch it, do whatever. And then maybe it can blow up to something really big. Who knows? So that's real fun. That's super cool. Thank you for sharing about your time as as an author, and B, as an actress and director even, which I think that's really cool. That's probably got to be a big job. I would almost consider that as being an author with the amount of stuff you got to think about.
And they're live. They're live people. You have to mold them into what it is you see and help them come together as one.
Yes.
To get that performance the way that it should be. Directing is a challenge, but really exciting. Really exciting.
I assume it's very fulfilling as well.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Yeah. So we'll do our last couple questions here. So basically, I want to do a kind of a roundabout.
when you sat down to write these, I'm sure you had a lesson learned. You want people to learn something. What do you want people to get from reading your books?
Because they're two separate. All right. So prohibition is an interesting one, and that was basically history. But there's an incident in there, and I'm not going to give it away.
Sure.
That at the time that it happened wasn't an unspoken incident. You couldn't discuss it. So for that book, there's a lot going on, a lot of levels. That book is about an older woman who used to be a rum runner, telling a younger college student about her past. And then there was a murder that happened, and the two of them back in the rum running days, and the two of them set about trying to figure out who the murderer was, and they uncover some things. So that's an interesting one. The other ones, Orchids of War and Storms from a Clear Sky. Part of the point for these is that there's two sides to every story. And there's two sides to why the relocation camps were in existence in the United States during World War II. And if by reading my books, you understand a little bit more of the fear, of the reality of the spies, of the times, of the tragedies that were happening, then the relocation camps are explained a little bit better, I feel. And so that's an offshoot of this. But then again, there were just, like I said, here's just one of the miracles that happened to me when writing this. I was in my Zumba class, and I thought, okay, I'm going to get into this book now. So there's a Japanese woman. I can go over and introduce myself. Well, it turns out it was somebody I had done hula with since I was 5 years old, when I was 5. Her father was in high school at Garfield with my mother. And so, we struck up a good conversation. And then it was in 2014. Remember, and I told you I went to Hawaii. When I was gone to Hawaii, there, one of the Japanese newspapers here had put out a thing about what it was like for Pearl Harbor Day, what it was like for a Caucasian American to have served overseas in Burma specifically, and against the Japanese, and to come home and then live in Seattle amongst the cultures, and have Japanese as your neighbors. Well, so this person comes up and shows me this, and she says, Denise, look at this. And the article that they had pulled out was an interview with my father that we did not even know existed. And it was 4 hours long, and they sent me the tape.
Wow.
I mean, I could go on for hours. I could literally go on for hours. Here's another one, just one more, and then you get what I'm talking about here. So I'm on Hawaii at that time, and I'm in outside of Kihei, and I am at an outside fair, and my husband has found these beautiful, beautiful crumpets. What were they? Anyway, cinnamon rolls. And he goes, Denise, I want those. So I say, okay, honey. So I'm looking at the woman who had made them, and I could tell that she was from the island. She was an islander. And I said, I'm really mad at myself. She's looking at me like, oi, we got some Howley here who's nuts, And she says, why? And I said, well, because I came over here and I have all of these things lined up that I wanted to do for the interviews, for the book I'm writing, but I really needed to talk to an entertainer who was Portuguese, Hawaiian, and who entertained for the troops. And her name was Moya Gray. And Moya looked at me and she said, my mother was an entertainer for the troops, and she's Portuguese, Hawaiian. Would you like to talk to her?
Ask and you shall receive.
Serious business. So I spent 3 hours with this woman who entertained the troops, and actually spent some time in Hollywood. Gorgeous woman. And she had us singing Christmas songs and doing all these things. But anyway, she was incredible. And so the little snippet that she told me about what happened one night when she was entertaining on Oahu is in my second book. So you see, through these interviews, I'm able to take what it was like and make it that realistic, because I talked to the person who actually had been there and been performing.
So basically bringing history to the now.
Right.
Yeah. No, I love that. And it, as far as I can tell, that's exactly what you've done so far. So
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. I'm looking forward to finishing this one. And then hopefully with time permitting, I'll read some other ones too, because I'd be really interested about the Prohibition one. I think that'd be neat, learning more about the local history. Because you learn some in school, but that's not where you really learn the good stuff. You learn some fun facts by diving deeper into talk with authors like yourself and reading books that you never would have read in school. So that leads me to our final question here. People will want to know where they can get a copy of all of your books. So where can they purchase those and get them from you?
Well, the best place, of course, because then I can sign them and ship them to you with a signed copy, would be on my webpage, which is simply my name, www.denisefrisino, FRISINO.com. If they're not in your local bookstore, which I'd love to support, please, they can order them. It will just take a little bit longer, but it's worth it to support your local bookstores as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I have an event on my webpage. I have an event calendar, and you'll see where I'm signing books. When my next appearances might be like at a Barnes and Noble or a fair, or I love to do those. I love it because I have repeat customers who come back all the time. And I do, since we're in Bremerton, I'm going to do the fair this year. Nice. Again, I'll be there a couple of days, and I think I'm doing the Blackberry Festival. I'm only there one day, but you see, I love because I love being local.
Yes.
And I love meeting my readers.
Yeah.
Very important. You're very important to us, those readers, let me tell you.
Yes, they are. They're what make the magic happen.
When you read the second book, we'll have to talk again, because I'm sure that you're going to be very interested in a lot of the little tiny things I have in there that are like, really, did that really happen? And I will tell you where I got it from and how it happened.
That is so cool. Well, this podcast will never shy away from a good interview with a good author about good books. I love stories. We all want to be captivated by stories, especially ones that actually happened or based on very true events. So with your third book, whenever you get finished with that, if you want to dive in for another interview to help promote that book, I will be happy to oblige. Just let me know and we'll set something up. So
thank you.
Yes, from us here at Mighty Books Podcast, I appreciate you, Denise, for coming on. I hope everyone here has a fabulous day, and please look up Denise Frisino and her books. Take care for now, everybody.
Are you an author? Do you know someone who is? If so, then message me, Ryan Oliver, at ryanmoliver.com to set up a free appointment to discuss being showcased on the Mighty Books Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe to the Mighty Books YouTube channel and share the link to this and more episodes with your friends and family. Thanks for listening. So long for now. Stay mighty and keep reading.